The storm was raging over the jungle moon as Daniel pushed through the thick vines and wet mud, struggling to keep his balance because the crash had left him hurt and tired. But he could not afford to stop, now since the night was full of predators that would gladly hunt a wounded human. His small cargo ship had been torn apart by a sudden engine failure when it entered the moon's atmosphere, and now it lay in pieces behind him, still smoking in the distance and full of broken supplies that he desperately needed. Daniel knew that if he did not find food, water, and shelter quickly, he would not live long enough to be rescued. So he forced himself to keep going, even though his muscles ached from the impact. As he pushed aside another curtain of leaves, he heard something faint and strange, like a soft cry mixed with a hiss, and at first he thought it was only the wind. But when he stood still and listened carefully, he heard it again, coming from somewhere deeper in the brush. Daniel slowly followed the sound, holding the small emergency torch he had taken from the wreck, and when he parted the leaves, he froze because lying curled up under the wide roots of a fallen tree was a small figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It looked like a young girl at first glance, but her ears were long and pointed like a cat's, and covered in soft fur that was the color of midnight. Her tail twitched weakly, and her large golden eyes stared at him full of fear. She was thin, almost skeletal, and her fur was matted with dirt and dried blood, and Daniel could see the burn marks on her side that told him she had been hurt badly, maybe even tortured. The girl hissed softly as if warning him to stay away, and she tried to crawl further into the hole between the roots. But she was too weak and collapsed on the wet ground, trembling. Daniel's heart tightened because he could not just leave her there to die, even though every instinct told him that helping her could be dangerous. He remembered his training that warned him never to interfere with alien species, but he also remembered how it felt to wake up alone after the crash, thinking he might be the only living soul left on this world. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements calm and gentle so as not to frighten her more, and he spoke softly, even though he knew she could not understand his language. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," he said in a low voice as he reached into his pack and pulled out a small packet of nutrient paste. He tore it open and placed it on the ground in front of her, and then backed away, hoping the smell would draw her out. The girl stared at the food with suspicion, but her hunger was stronger than her fear, and after a long pause, she crawled forward and sniffed it carefully before licking it up with quick, desperate motions. Daniel watched her eat, and he felt a sense of relief because at least now she might survive the night. When she finished the packet, she looked at him again, her ears twitching, and Daniel could see the question in her eyes. He knew he could not leave her alone because she was too weak to defend herself, and the scavenger drones that haunted the jungle would eventually find her. He reached out his hand slowly, palm up, so she could see he held no weapon, and after a moment's hesitation, she stretched out her clawed fingers and touched his hand lightly as if testing whether he was real. That small gesture broke the wall between them, and Daniel gently lifted her into his arms. She was light as a feather and so cold he could feel her trembling against his chest, but she did not fight him. He carried her carefully through the jungle, heading back toward the wreck, because it was the only shelter he had for now. The journey was hard because the terrain was rough, and the rain had turned the ground to slippery mud, but Daniel kept going one step at a time, his eyes scanning the shadows for danger. By the time he reached the wreck, the storm was even worse, and lightning flashed across the dark sky, lighting up the twisted remains of his ship. Daniel climbed inside through a hole in the side and lowered the girl onto a piece of unbroken flooring. He quickly searched through the wreckage for the med kit, and when he found it, he returned to her side. She watched him closely as he cleaned the burn wounds on her side and wrapped them with bandages, and though she hissed softly from the pain, she did not try to pull away. Daniel found an old thermal blanket and wrapped it around her small body, hoping it would keep her warm, and then he gave her another packet of food and a small bottle of water. She ate slowly this time, her golden eyes never leaving his face, and Daniel wondered who she was and how she had ended up alone on this dangerous moon. He thought about asking her name, but he knew she would not understand, so instead he simply said, "You're safe now," and hoped she could feel the meaning in his voice. The rain drummed against the broken hull of the ship as night fell, and Daniel sat near the girl, keeping the torchlight low so as not to draw attention from any nearby raiders or predators. He felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, but he forced himself to stay awake because the jungle outside was alive with movement, and he could hear the distant hum of drones searching the area. He tightened his grip on the small plasma cutter he had salvaged from the wreck, ready to defend her if anything tried to come inside. As the hours passed, the girl slowly relaxed and curled up near him, under the blanket, her tail wrapping around herself in a protective coil. Daniel could feel the warmth of her small body beside him, and he knew he had made the right choice, even if it meant putting himself in danger. She had no one else in this world, and neither did he, and somehow that thought gave him strength. Made a silent promise in his heart that he would protect her, no matter what, and that he would find a way off this moon for both of them. He did not know how long it would take or what dangers they would face, but he knew one thing for sure. He was not going to leave her behind. The jungle outside roared with unseen life, and the wind howled through the broken metal, but inside the wreck, there was a small, fragile sense of peace. Daniel looked down at the girl whose breathing had grown slow and steady as she slept, and for the first time since the crash he felt a spark of hope. He whispered quietly to himself as his eyes closed in exhaustion that tomorrow he would start making a plan, and that no matter what came next they would face it together. The first light of dawn slowly touched the broken hull of the crashed ship, filling the inside with a soft glow, and Daniel opened his tired eyes, feeling the weight of little sleep still pressing on his body, but he forced himself to wake because the day ahead was going to be difficult. He looked over at the small alien girl still curled up beneath the thermal blanket, and he felt a small measure of relief when he saw that her breathing was steady and calm, which meant her condition had improved slightly during the night. Daniel moved quietly so he would not startle her and began checking what was left of the supplies because they had very little food and even less water, and he knew that he would need to search the jungle again to keep them both alive. As he worked, he could feel her eyes on him, and when he turned, he saw her watching him carefully from under the blanket, with those large golden eyes that seemed to hold both curiosity and fear. Daniel offered a small smile, trying to show her that he meant no harm, and slowly held out another packet of nutrient paste. She hesitated for a long moment, but hunger won, and she reached for it with her small clawed hand, snatching it quickly, as if afraid it might be taken away. Daniel watched her eat and realized how fragile she looked, even though there was a hidden strength in the way she sat upright, despite the pain from her wounds. After she finished eating, Daniel tried to speak softly, pointing at himself and saying, "Daniel," because he thought if she could at least learn his name, it might help her feel safer. She tilted her head slightly and blinked as if trying to understand, then she made a soft sound that almost resembled the word, though it was broken and strange. Daniel smiled and repeated it again and again until she made a clearer attempt at the sound, and this time it almost matched. He nodded with encouragement, and she gave a small, uncertain smile of her own and pointed at herself, saying a single word in her own language. Daniel guessed it was her name, and he tried to repeat it, but she let out a quiet laugh at his clumsy attempt, and for a moment, the fear in her eyes faded. This small exchange gave Daniel hope because it meant that they could begin to communicate, little by little, and build some trust. He offered her a hand, motioning for her to follow, and together, they stepped out of the wreckage into the damp jungle morning. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves, and distant calls of unknown creatures echoed through the trees. Daniel kept her close as they searched for edible plants and clean water because he knew the jungle was full of dangers and she was still too weak to defend herself properly. She stayed near him at all times, her ears flicking at every noise, and Daniel noticed how her sharp eyes seemed to catch every movement in the undergrowth long before he did. They found a narrow stream, hidden under thick vines, and Daniel knelt down to fill their small containers with the fresh water, but when he glanced at her, he noticed how tense she had become. Her ears were pointed straight up and her tail lashed nervously, and suddenly Daniel realized they were not alone. He grabbed the plasma cutter from his belt and turned just as a scavenger drone burst through the trees, its metal body gleaming in the filtered sunlight. The drone's sensors locked onto them, and it emitted a high-pitched alarm as it hovered forward with deadly intent. Daniel shouted for her to run, but she did not flee. Instead, she sprang forward with surprising speed and strength, her claws flashing as she leapt onto the drone, tearing into its wiring with a ferocity that shocked Daniel. Sparks flew as the machine fought back, striking her across the shoulder with a burning arc of energy, but she did not let go until the drone collapsed lifeless on the ground. She stumbled back, breathing hard, and Daniel rushed to her side, pulling her away from the wrecked machine and checking the fresh wound on her shoulder. It was shallow but still bleeding, and Daniel quickly tore a strip of cloth from his shirt to bandage it. She allowed him to tend to her injury, though her golden eyes were fierce and unblinking, and Daniel realized that she was far from helpless. Yet even as he tied the makeshift bandage, he could feel a growing connection between them, because she had risked herself to protect him, and he knew she had done it not out of instinct, but because she trusted him at least a little. He gently touched her arm and said, "Thank you," even though she did not understand the words, because he wanted her to feel the gratitude in his voice. After that, they returned to the ship with the water containers and whatever food they could. Carrie and Daniel began working on improving the shelter because the wreckage was too exposed. He gathered fallen branches and scrap metal from the debris, and with her help, they built a crude wall around the opening of the hull to give them more protection from both predators and raiders. She was quick and agile even in her weakened state, and Daniel noticed how she seemed to enjoy helping because she made a soft humming sound as they worked side by side. As the sun set, they sat together near a small fire Daniel had managed to start, using an old ignition coil from the ship, and he offered her another meal from the dwindling supply. She accepted it more calmly this time, and even reached out to hand him half of it, which made Daniel smile because it was the first sign that she no longer saw him only as a stranger, but as someone she could trust. The night air grew colder, and she inched closer to the fire, wrapping her tail around herself, but Daniel could see her shivering, so he offered the thermal blanket again. She hesitated for only a moment before sliding under it, and to his surprise, she motioned for him to share it as well. Daniel sat beside her, feeling the warmth of her small body, and he realized how quiet the jungle seemed now compared to the first night. He looked down at her as she leaned slightly against him, her golden eyes half closed from exhaustion, and he thought about how quickly things had changed since the crash. He had been alone and hopeless, but now he had someone to protect, and that gave him a reason to keep fighting. As the fire crackled softly, Daniel whispered to himself that he would find a way off this moon, and that when he did, he would make sure she was safe. He did not know how they would manage it, because the wreck was beyond repair, but he refused to believe that they were trapped forever. Tomorrow he would begin searching the jungle for other sources of salvage, maybe even an old landing beacon he could repair to call for help. But tonight he simply sat beside the alien girl, who had begun to trust him, and he let himself feel a small spark of hope again. The morning came quietly over the jungle moon. Daniel woke before the sun had fully risen because he knew their time in the wreckage was running out, and they needed to find a way to leave this dangerous place before the raiders or scavenger drones discovered their location. He looked at the small alien girl who was still sleeping beside him under the thermal blanket, and he thought about how far they had come in such a short time, because when he had first found her, she was too weak. and frightened to even move. But now she was beginning to trust him, and he felt responsible for her safety in a way he could not explain. Daniel quietly gathered what little equipment he had left and began scavenging through the broken pieces of his ship for anything that could help him build a signal or a means of travel, because he knew there was no hope of repairing the main vessel completely. The engines were destroyed beyond any chance of recovery, and the communication system had been shattered during the crash, but there were still smaller components that might be useful. The girl soon woke and joined him in searching the debris, her sharp eyes spotting pieces he might have missed, and together they collected wires, battery packs, and fragments of the navigation console. As they worked, Daniel could not help but notice how much stronger she seemed now compared to the first day, because her movements were more confident and her eyes were brighter, though she still carried the scars of her injuries. She occasionally spoke in her own language, using short words and gestures to explain what she was doing, and Daniel found himself learning bits of her speech, though he knew it would take time before he could understand her fully. He pointed at her and said, "Lyra," a name he had chosen for her because it reminded him of music, and she tilted her head curiously but did not object, so he assumed she accepted it. Later that day, Daniel and Lyra decided to search deeper into the jungle for more salvage because the parts they had found were not enough to build a beacon. They followed a narrow animal trail through the trees, moving carefully because the sounds of the forest were louder than usual, and Daniel could not shake the feeling that something was watching them. He kept the plasma cutter in his hand ready for trouble, and Lyra stayed close, her tail twitching nervously as her ears caught every distant sound. The trail led them to the remains of another crash site, one far older than Daniel's because the wreckage was covered in moss and vines. It appeared to be a small shuttle of unknown origin, and Daniel quickly climbed inside the broken hull, searching for useful parts. To his surprise, he found a half-intact power core and the remains of a long-range transmitter. Though it was damaged, it might still be repaired. He carefully removed the components and handed them to Lyra, who carried them in a bundle made of vines they had tied together earlier. Just as they were about to leave, Daniel heard the unmistakable hum of engines approaching through the sky, and his heart pounded because he knew that sound belonged to raider ships. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her into the shadows as 3 black craft descended above the jungle, scanning the ground with harsh beams of light. Lyra trembled as she whispered something in her own language, and Daniel could see the fear in her eyes because she clearly recognized the raiders and what they had done to her before. Daniel held her close and promised in a low voice that he would not let them take her again, even though he knew she could not understand his words because the meaning was clear in his tone. The raiders landed not far from the wreck and began searching the jungle with armed drones moving ahead of them. Daniel realized they had to move quickly before they were cornered, so he led Lyra away from the site as quietly as possible. But one of the drones spotted them and let out a loud alarm. What followed was a desperate chase through the dense jungle, as Daniel and Lyra ran as fast as they could, dodging through trees and jumping over roots, while the drones fired bursts of energy that scorched the ground around them. Daniel fired back with the plasma cutter, but its limited power could not destroy more than 1 drone at a time. Lyra surprised him again by leaping onto one of the machines and tearing it apart with her claws, just as she had done before. But there were too many, and Daniel knew they could not keep running forever. They reached a clearing where Daniel saw an opportunity to fight back. He quickly rigged one of the salvaged battery packs with a detonator and threw it at the nearest group of drones. The explosion ripped through the machines, sending shards of metal flying and buying them a few moments of safety, but the noise would surely draw the raiders themselves. Daniel and Lyra sprinted toward the wrecked ship they had found earlier and took cover inside its broken hull. As they caught their breath, Daniel looked at Lyra and saw the fear and determination in her golden eyes. He asked her softly what the raiders had done to her before he found her, as she hesitated, but then slowly began to speak using halting words mixed with gestures. From her broken explanation, Daniel learned that she had been captured by the raiders and sold like an animal to be displayed as an exotic creature before she managed to escape during a raid. She had been running and hiding ever since until Daniel found her half dead beneath the tree roots. Hearing her story filled Daniel with anger because he could not imagine the pain she had endured, and he promised himself again that he would never let anyone harm her. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently, and she looked at him with a mix of sadness and gratitude, as if she understood the vow he had made. When the sounds of the raiders searching the jungle grew louder, Daniel knew they could not stay hidden for long. He decided that once night fell, they would return to their shelter with the salvaged parts and try to build a functioning transmitter, because it was their only hope of calling for help. He also knew that the raiders would continue to hunt for them, and that sooner or later they would be forced to fight again. As they prepared to leave, Lyra placed a small clawed hand on Daniel's arm and spoke his name softly for the first time. Sound of it in her voice startled him and filled him with a strange warmth, because it meant she truly trusted him now. Daniel squeezed her hand and told her they would survive this together, and then they slipped back into the shadows of the jungle, moving quickly and silently toward their makeshift home, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The night was heavy with shadows, and Daniel sat near the faint glow of the small fire. He had managed to hide deep within the wreckage walls because he knew the light could draw attention, yet he needed it to keep them warm and to boil the water they had found earlier. Lyra sat close to him, her golden eyes reflecting the flickering flames, and Daniel could see that she was still shaken from their narrow escape with the raiders. He wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but he knew words would not be enough, and so he simply reached over and placed his hand gently on hers, letting her feel the promise in his touch that he would not allow harm to come to her. They had managed to return to their shelter without being seen, and now the salvaged parts from the old wreck lay scattered on the ground in front of Daniel, who was studying each piece carefully because building a functioning transmitter was their only chance to call for help. The power core was unstable and the antenna badly damaged, but Daniel believed he could repair it if he worked carefully and used every bit of skill he had learned during his years as a cargo pilot. Lyra watched him silently for a while before quietly starting to assist him, handing him tools and holding the wires steady when he needed it. And Daniel was grateful for her help because her quick reflexes saved him from making mistakes more than once. Hours passed as they worked through the night, and though exhaustion weighed on Daniel's body, he kept going because he knew time was against them. The raiders would not stop searching, and it was only a matter of days before they discovered the wreck. Lyra understood this as well, and she did not complain or rest even when her hands began to shake from fatigue. Daniel could feel how much she wanted to survive, and he admired her strength because she had already endured so much. By the time dawn began to break, the transmitter was nearly complete, and Daniel carefully connected the last wires before switching it on. A small red light flickered and then held steady, which meant the device had power, and Daniel allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He tuned the frequency to a standard emergency channel and began sending out a distress signal, hoping that some passing ship or nearby colony would hear it. Lyra leaned close, watching the device with hopeful eyes, and Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders because he knew the waiting would be the hardest part. For 2 days, they listened for a response, while hiding deeper in the jungle during daylight and returning to the wreck only at night. Daniel had begun to fear that no one would hear the signal when finally a faint voice crackled through the small speaker. It was a colony patrol ship from a nearby system, and they had received his coordinates. Relief flooded Daniel as he confirmed their position and was told that a rescue ship would arrive within a day. Lyra looked at him with wide eyes when he explained through gestures that they were going to be saved, and she gave a small smile full of quiet joy, because the idea of leaving this dangerous moon felt almost impossible. The next 24 hours felt longer than any they had lived so far, because Daniel knew the raiders could still find them before the rescue arrived. He kept his weapon ready at all times and stayed alert for any sound that did not belong in the jungle. Lyra helped gather food and water, and even prepared the area for a quick departure, because she had learned from him how important it was to be ready. As the sun set, Daniel climbed a nearby ridge with Lyra at his side, and they both looked at the sky waiting for the first sign of the rescue ship. When the bright streak of an engine finally appeared above the clouds, Daniel felt a rush of relief so strong he could barely breathe. He fired a small flare into the air to mark their position, and within minutes, the sleek white vessel descended through the canopy. A team of uniformed humans stepped out, greeting Daniel warmly and scanning Lyra with cautious eyes because they were not sure what species she was. Daniel stood in front of her protectively and explained that she was with him and that she would not be left behind under any circumstances. The rescue team agreed, and soon they were both aboard the ship, leaving the deadly jungle moon behind. Colony they were taken to was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen, because it was full of people and technology and wide open spaces that felt safe and welcoming. Daniel was offered a small plot of land on the colony's edge as thanks for his years of service as a cargo pilot, and he gladly accepted because he wanted a quiet life where they could both recover. He built a small home with the help of local workers, and Lyra stayed close by learning how to live in this new world, though she was wary of strangers at first. As weeks turned into months, Daniel and Lyra slowly settled into a new routine. They planted crops and raised animals on their land, and Daniel spent his days repairing old equipment for the colony in exchange for supplies. Lyra discovered a love for working in the fields where the sun warmed her fur and the gentle wind carried the scents of flowers and grass. She had changed so much since the day Daniel had first found her, because now she was strong and confident, though she still liked to curl up near the fire at night when the air grew cold. The bond between them grew deeper with each passing day, because they had survived so much together, and Daniel could no longer imagine his life without her. She had become more than just the alien girl he had rescued, because she was his family now, and he knew she felt the same. Lyra began showing subtle signs of affection, brushing her tail against him as she passed or resting her head on his shoulder when they sat together under the stars. And Daniel always felt a quiet happiness in those moments. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Lyra surprised Daniel by taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach, before looking into his eyes with a soft smile. Daniel was confused at first, but then he realized what she was trying to tell him, and his heart skipped a beat because he understood she was expecting. He pulled her close, unable to find the words to express how he felt, and she simply held him quietly as the sun set behind them, casting warm light over the home they had built together. Daniel knew that their lives had changed forever, and that they now had something even greater to protect than before. He promised himself once again that he would always keep her safe, and that their children would grow up knowing only love and security. As night fell, he and Lyra stood together on the porch of their small home, watching the stars and dreaming of the future. The seasons had passed quietly on the edge of the colony, and Daniel had grown used to the soft rhythm of their life, far away from the noise of raider ships and the constant fear that had once followed them through the jungle moon. He woke each morning to the sound of birds nesting in the trees surrounding the small homestead, and the gentle hum of the wind as it rolled across the fields they had planted together. Lyra would often be awake before him, tending to the animals, or walking barefoot through the grass with her tail flicking behind her as the first light of the sun touched her fur. Daniel would watch her for a moment before joining her, because there was something peaceful in seeing her happy and safe in the place they now called home. The small home they had built with the help of the colony had become warm and full of life. With the walls lined with simple furniture Daniel had crafted himself from local wood. He had learned how to shape and sand the pieces while Lyra decorated the rooms with bright fabrics and trinkets she liked to collect from the colony market. Together, they had turned the house into a place where they could raise their family, and Daniel could not stop smiling when he thought about what was coming because Lyra's stomach had grown rounder with each passing week. She would place his hand on it when the little ones kicked, and they would sit together in quiet awe, because the feeling was unlike anything Daniel had ever known. As the days moved forward, Daniel prepared for the birth the best he could asking the colony's medic for advice and gathering supplies, because he wanted to make sure Lyra had everything she needed. She was strong and calm, even as her time drew closer, though he could see the nervousness in her golden eyes when she thought he was not looking. Daniel reassured her with gentle words and the warmth of his hands holding hers, telling her that she was not alone and that he would be there for her no matter what. Lyra would nod softly and lean against him, and together, they would wait for the moment that would change their lives forever. The night finally came when the air was cool and the stars were bright in the sky above their quiet home. Lyra's breathing grew heavy, and Daniel helped her to the bedroom where he had prepared blankets and warm water, just as the medic had instructed. She gripped his hand tightly as the hours passed, and Daniel stayed by her side, whispering encouragement and wiping the sweat from her brow, because he wanted her to know that she was strong enough to bring their children into the world. When the first small cry filled the air, Daniel felt tears sting his eyes, because he had never heard a sound so beautiful. One by one, the kittens were born, tiny and fragile, with soft fur and bright eyes that glimmered faintly like Lyra's. Daniel carefully wrapped each one in cloth and placed them beside their mother, who curled her tail around them protectively as she purred softly in a way that Daniel had never heard before. He sat beside her, holding her hand and looking at the newborn kittens with a mixture of awe and pride, because they were a perfect blend of both their worlds. The days that followed were some of the happiest Daniel had ever known. The kittens grew stronger with each sunrise, their little bodies full of energy as they stumbled through the house, learning how to walk and climb. Lyra watched them constantly, her golden eyes filled with love as she guided them gently with soft touches of her tail or the quiet rumble of her voice. Daniel would often find himself laughing as the kittens clambered over his boots or curled up in his lap, purring contentedly, and he realized how much his life had changed since the day he had crashed on the jungle moon. There were moments when Daniel thought about the hardships they had faced, the raiders, the drones, the long nights of fear and exhaustion, but those memories only made him appreciate the life they had built even more. He knew that everything they had endured had led them to this moment, and that rescuing Lyra had given him a purpose he had never expected to find. She had brought light into his life, and now they had a family to protect and cherish together. The colony had welcomed them with open arms, and many of the settlers would stop by to visit, bringing small gifts for the kittens or simply to watch them play in the sunlit fields. Daniel was grateful for the kindness of the people around them, but he was even more grateful for the quiet moments at the end of the day when he and Lyra could sit together on the porch of their home watching the kittens chase fireflies in the twilight. Lyra would rest her head on his shoulder, and Daniel would wrap an arm around her as the stars began to appear in the night sky. One evening as they sat there, Daniel spoke softly to Lyra, telling her how proud he was of the life they had created, and how much he loved her and the little ones. She looked at him with eyes that shimmered in the starlight, and she spoke his name in the soft way she always did when she was moved by emotion. She reached out and placed his hand on the tiny bundle of kittens curled up beside her, and Daniel felt their small hearts beating steadily beneath his palm. In that moment, Daniel understood that he was no longer alone in the universe, because he had a family and a future worth fighting for. The fear and loneliness that had once haunted him were gone, replaced by the warmth of the bond he shared with Lyra and their children. He smiled as he watched the kittens play, tumbling through the grass with little bursts of energy because he knew they would grow up surrounded by love and safety, and that they would never know the pain Lyra had once endured. As the night deepened, and the sounds of the colony faded into the distance, Daniel looked up at the endless sky, full of stars, and felt a quiet peace settle over him. He remembered the vow he had made on the jungle moon when he had first held Lyra in his arms, and he silently promised again that he would protect this family with everything he had. Lyra leaned closer, wrapping her tail around his arm, and Daniel kissed the top of her head, feeling the soft warmth of her fur. He whispered a thank you to the universe for bringing them together, because he knew that without her he might never have discovered the meaning of home. Together, they watched their kittens chase one another under the glow of the moon, their tiny voices filling the night with laughter and purrs. Daniel realized then that the journey they had taken was not just about survival, because it had led them to this moment where love and hope had replaced fear and loneliness. He smiled as he held Lyra close and thought of the future that lay ahead, a future filled with family and joy, and the simple happiness of knowing that they would never be alone. Again, the end.